We are only hours away. Americans are deciding between re-electing Donald Trump or electing Joe Biden president. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. It is the last day of what's been somewhat of a controversial campaign, with supporters ignoring guidelines for COVID-19. US President Donald Trump has been having packed rallies. Meanwhile, former Vice President Joe Biden adopted a very different approach, with a few cars, honking cars, in the audience. For more on the US election, let's turn to CGTN's Nathan King, who's at the White House. Nathan, it's the eve before the final day of voting. What are you hearing?
You know, both candidates are trying to leave nothing to chance, but of course it's in the hands of the American voter. Yeah, you're absolutely right about the different styles. Joe Biden, this sort of drive-in rally, sort of started the convention, and it's not about it. It's very American, isn't it? So drive-in, theater field, tailgating. The US president, though, acting very much like he was in 2016. Even though he's the incumbent, he's acting like the insurgent as well. These mass rallies, despite the COVID pandemic. He loves the crowds, and the crowds love to see him too. That is also true. Joe Biden, well, he decided he would put a toe in a pretty Republican state, and that's Ohio. The polls are tighter than they should be there, with perhaps a Democratic pickup there. I think Trump won by 8 points 4 years ago, and he was in Cleveland saying, we can get this president out. Take a listen.
One more day. Tomorrow we have an opportunity to put an end to a presidency that's divided this nation. Tomorrow we can put an end to a president that has failed to protect this nation. And tomorrow we can put an end to a president that has fanned the flames of hate all across this country.
Now, Biden went back to Pennsylvania, where a lot of candidates are going. In fact, President Trump started in Florida, went to North Carolina, went back to Pennsylvania, flew up to Michigan, went to Wisconsin, going back to Michigan. So it's quite incredible. I think 7 or 8 different Biden team members were in Pennsylvania as well. So they really are a crisscrossing. Now, the polls suggesting Biden may have an edge, but you know, the US president has defied political gravity before squeaking out that win in 2016. He thinks there's a silent majority of voters still. This is what he said in North Carolina.
Tomorrow we are going to win this state, and we are going to win 4 more years in our great White House. With your vote, we will continue to cut your taxes, cut regulations, support our great police, support our fantastic military.
The fact he was in North Carolina saying that, and suggests, though, however, that the polling doesn't necessarily match the optimism in the president's rhetoric.
Right, that's something I wanted to ask you about, Nathan. As you point out, the president is known for defying political gravity, as you put it. Yeah. But when we look at these pictures of the president's rallies, thousands of people, lots of enthusiasm, lots of energy, what does that tell us? Could there be a late surge for the president at this stage?
Well, I think there's 2 votes going on here. You've seen the massive early voting and mail-in ballots that we've seen in this sort of COVID election, but also people wanting to cast their votes as well, making sure they counted early. And we've seen, what, nearly 100 million Americans vote, 70-something% of the 2016 turnout. Now, the Democrats seem to have an edge over that quite significantly. However, the US president's criticism of mail-in voting and early voting suggests that his supporters will turn out on November 3rd. Republicans tend to more. The question is, are there enough of them? And there are so many new votes here, especially among young people, as well as different demographics. It's going to be very difficult to tell. However, a larger turnout usually helps Democrats. Now, let me show you this poll, because these are states that Trump won in 2016 and needs to win essentially all of them. I mean, if he loses Florida or North Carolina, it's pretty much over. He is behind in nearly all these polls. Some have him tied in Georgia as well as and Florida as well. And look at the national lead, 52-42 on the night before an election. Now, if we hadn't had 2016, we'd all be making predictions right now. But we had 2016. But Hillary Clinton was never this far ahead in the polls. And also, We have not seen the huge turnouts that we've seen in 2016. This could be an even bigger turnout. So let's wait and see. Obviously, COVID and questions about who counts mail-in ballots and when, which the president has been getting stronger and stronger in his rhetoric over the last few days, could also muddle this race. But you see those 4 states I just mentioned there? They will actually probably all have results in the first few hours of after the polls close. So those are the ones to watch. If the Republicans go south in Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, or Arizona, it's going to be a lot easier for the Democrats.
Okay, we shall have to look out for them. Nathan, thanks a lot. That's CGTN's Nathan King at the White House. Well, to discuss what we can expect from this election, let's bring in our panel. Joel Rubin is a Democrat strategist joining us via Skype from Chevy Chase in Maryland. From Mount Pleasant in South Carolina, Eric Bolling is a political commentator and host of America This Week. Here in Washington, D.C., Katie Barlow is a lawyer and journalist Aaron Mattei joins us from New York via Skype. Welcome to all of you. Eric Bolling, let me start with you. Listening to those numbers there that Nathan was talking about, not a pretty picture for President Trump, but he has been barnstorming around the country over the last few days, doing as many as 4 or 5 rallies per day. What's the mood in the Trump camp on this eve?
I think their mood is this, Anand. We got him just where we want him, as Nathan astutely pointed out, 2016. Same thing happened. I'm going to correct Nathan, and he's not going to like this, but I'm going to correct him. Hillary Clinton did have this type of lead in important swing states going into that election. No one saw Trump winning Michigan and Wisconsin. Nobody saw that happening. Also, I'm going to circle North Carolina. He said those 4 states will end early on tomorrow night, on the election night. That's not true. North Carolina has just petitioned and gotten 9 days to count late votes. So votes coming in 9 days after the election, unless there's a resounding win by that was not Freudian, by Joe Biden. I think you will see this going into the next couple of days afterwards. He's right on one thing. If President Trump loses Florida or Georgia, it's likely impossible for him to win.
There is something else happening, though, Eric, and that is we're seeing a significant shift in voter preferences, that's, we believe, the polls, in states like Texas, Arizona, and in Georgia as well.
I will go on a limb here. It's night before the election. I did this in 2016. He will win Texas, Florida, and Georgia resoundingly. It won't even be close in those 3 states. I think he has a real shot at losing Pennsylvania. Therefore, his only path to victory, which I think he will win, will be North Carolina plus one of those 3 Rust Belt states, Wisconsin, Minnesota, or Michigan. I think he may get Wisconsin and Michigan, giving him the victory.
All right, let's go to Joel. Joel, more than 95 million votes already cast in this election. History tells us that the early vote normally favors Democrats, but 2020, of course, has been anything but normal. It's been the year of the pandemic. Can the Biden camp take anything for granted at this stage?
Oh, Anand, you framed it very well. No, nothing is being taken for granted. And it's a fascinating moment in American democracy. The will of the people is what's going to decide this election. 95 million votes cast already. That's twice as much practically from early voting in 2016, nearly 70% of the votes. And from the Democratic perspective, we feel like there are significant votes to still get, and that we've already banked significant leads in these key states that we were just discussing. So it makes it that much harder for Donald Trump to gather enough votes on election day to surpass significant Democratic leads. And so the will of the people, we see people coming out despite the virus and really wanting to make sure their voices are heard.
Right, Joel, I would imagine that there's some very nervous people in the Biden campaign right now. When polls start closing at 7 p.m. Eastern time here in the United States tomorrow, which states will they be looking at?
Well, no doubt nerves abound everywhere, and I think that's across the country, quite frankly. I don't have a single friend or family member or colleague who isn't nervous right now from both sides of the aisle, quite frankly. I think there are some key states we've already discussed. Certainly, Pennsylvania is central and Florida is central, but looking at Georgia, looking at North Carolina and Texas as pickup opportunities, Arizona as well for the Democrats, that is. In Wisconsin, we're very strong. Minnesota is going to be a little closer, as is Michigan. These are the ones to look at. And it's really important as well to understand that every vote counts and every vote should be counted. And it's very normal for votes to be counted after Election Day. That's the history of America. We trust our local officials who do the counting to get it right. They're bipartisan and nonpartisan. We trust our people to get these elections done well. And so far, they've been running very strong elections at the state level, which is where they're actually administered, not by the president and not at the federal level.
All right, let me bring Katie Barlow into this conversation. Katie, great to have you on the show. If we look at what the media have been saying for the past few weeks, there's a very real likelihood that we will not have a result on Tuesday night or early Wednesday morning. There could be a dispute over counting. There could be a dispute of who wins. Here's President Trump talking about that.
You're going to have 1 or 2 or 3 states, depending on how it ends up, where they're tabulating ballots, and the rest of the world is waiting to find out. And I think there's great danger to it, and I think a lot of fraud and misuse can take place. We're going to go in the night of, as soon as that election's over, we're going in with our lawyers.
So, Katie, when the president talks about going in with our lawyers, those are his words. What is he talking about? What are his lawyers expected to do at that time?
Well, I think the first things first is that the total votes that the American people cast on Election Day and before the election are never totaled and tallied by election night. It always takes days and sometimes weeks after to tally those votes, anywhere from 2 days to certify the votes in Delaware to over a month later in California to certify the votes. And it's also not strange for the presidential candidates to send lawyers to all of the battleground states to keep an eye to make sure there's no voter fraud, no voter suppression, or anything strange that's happening in those states. So it's not strange that the Trump campaign would be sending lawyers, as we know, to places like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. What is strange is the president suggesting that the court will decide this election, that a 9th justice was needed on the Supreme Court in order to be able to decide the election, that, as he said yesterday at a campaign rally, the election will maybe be decided shortly after Election Day. Thank you, Supreme Court. And so that is a bit worrisome for court watchers, wondering if we're going to repeat what happened or something similar to what happened in 2000. And we also have not seen the sheer volume of election-related cases before, as we have been seeing over the summer related to state COVID response mechanisms and trying to help people vote in a safe and orderly manner before November 3rd.
All right, Aaron Maté, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that this is a very deeply divided country right now. Very little common ground between the two sides, but what are the chances of this election being resolved on Tuesday or perhaps on Wednesday at the ballot box? Or are we going to see this long, drawn-out legal process that could possibly last weeks like we saw in the year 2000?
Well, you know, as you said, we've heard indications from both sides that there will be a legal fight. Both candidates have an army of lawyers, and I think they're prepared to use them. I have heard from sources I trust that the internal polling for Democrats is looking very good. Now, of course, we heard similar things in 2016, and Trump came away with it, so who knows. But if this is close at all, then yes, I think we're looking at inevitably a drawn-out legal fight.
When you say you've heard from sources that you trust that the polling is looking good, are those in specific states or across the board?
Across the board, but certainly in the states that Democrats care about that are most in their target list, the battlegrounds, Ohio, Pennsylvania. What I heard from people who I trust is that internal polling for Democrats is looking very good. But again, I think we all have to be cautious. In 2016, everybody thought it would be a landslide. I think the one difference this time is that back then Trump was able to portray himself as being this sort of firebrand, anti-establishment candidate. He can't this time. He's now the establishment. He hasn't drained the swamp. And now he's presiding over a pandemic with more than 230,000 deaths.
Although he is behaving this time like he is the insurgent, doesn't he?
He is. That's his shtick. And enough people buy it. And I think part of the problem with Joe Biden is that he's such an establishment politician. Yeah. Not able to counter Trump on that front. But still, 4 years in office, in the White House, in the highest position in the land, it does undermine your ability to claim that you're an insurgent.
Eric, you know, the Trump campaign's going to have to answer for some of his supporters' behavior. at some time. We're seeing some of the president's supporters go to extreme lengths to stop Biden, including what amounts to intimidation in certain circumstances. We saw that in Texas, where a Biden campaign bus was surrounded by vehicles with people waving Trump flags. In fact, the Democrats had to cancel 3 events over there. Shouldn't this be condemned by the president?
Anand, no one stopped that bus. They were escorting they were driving alongside the bus and around. No one stopped the bus. They canceled 3 campaign events because no one was showing up in Texas. So all this gamesmanship that's going on about Texas maybe flipping is nonsense. It's not going to flip. It's going to go strongly Republican. Yeah. It'll go strongly for Trump. You'll see this. Here's an issue. You know what really matters in this election the day before the actual vote, the physical vote happens? There are cities being boarded up from Los Angeles, Rodeo Drive, all the way through the Midwest, all the way to D.C. and New York City, where boards are going up on businesses everywhere because they're worried about rioting, looting, the violence that happens. Guess who creates all that violence? The Biden supporters, the left, the Democrats, the Antifas, the Black Lives Matter. That's where all the violence is coming from. So if you're a suburban white woman voter, when you see that, you say, do I really want these people on our streets every time something goes wrong? They're going to break windows. They're going to go wipe out, just clear out a Walmart because they feel they're entitled to doing so. Yeah. That law and order goes to President Trump, and that's what will drive some of the people who haven't voted yet or haven't said they're going to vote one way or the other to the Trump campaign.
Yes, Eric, people are taking precautions. Even here in Washington, we see parts of the city being boarded up. But getting back to Trump supporters surrounding that bus, I mean, that's being investigated by the FBI right now. And if they were just escorting the bus, why would the FBI be investigating it?
I don't know. Why does the FBI do whatever they do? They do it to try and keep the peace so the other side says, look, okay, thank you for looking into that. But what is wrong with riding along? I mean, it's riding alongside the bus. Don't let them fool you by saying they canceled the Texas events for any other reason other than there were no people showing up to the prior 3 Texas events.
All right, we have Joel with us. He's a Democratic strategist. Joel, you want to respond to that?
Well, it's just sad that there's such a blasé attitude towards voter intimidation being communicated by Eric. And voter intimidation seems to be the strategy right now that President Trump is trying to facilitate. And he can't gain more votes. He needs to keep Democrats at home. And that is failing. Democrats were not staying home. We're not intimidated. But his strategy is to make a constant barrage of arguments. Oh, don't count the votes if they come in after Election Day, if they're by mail, as if somehow mail-in balloting is not legal. It is legal. Or, for example, let's get 127,000 ballots from Harris County, a very Democratic county in Texas, thrown out. Of course, that failed in the courts as well, that disenfranchisement. So the use of violence, intimidation, and gaslighting by the president, it's not surprising.
That's
he knows he doesn't have enough votes.
No one on the right uses violence. The violence comes from the Democrats and the left.
I let you create conspiracy theories a moment ago about all these hidden forces that are somehow out there collecting each other to intimidate suburbanites. That is not no. I'm gonna make my.
That's not what I said.
Okay, one moment.
One moment. I said
Eric,
when there's violence in the street. I said when there's violence in the street.
You are
women,
conspiracy
suburban
theories
women voters will vote for the law and order candidate.
Eric,
that's different.
Law and order.
Can't spin it.
The president is the one who is actually arguing against law and order and arguing for people to surround a bus and try to intimidate voters. That's the anti-law
and order. The president backs law enforcement. The president backs keeping the streets of America safe, sound, and against rioting and looting.
Eric, that is a complete.
It's true.
That is gaslighting at its finest.
Okay, Joel, there's one more thing I want to ask you. We're seeing these massive rallies that President Trump is holding. In fact, I looked at some pictures last night of a rally in Pennsylvania. I mean, it was just a sea of people as far as the eye could see. Yeah. By contrast, we don't see that with the Biden campaign.
Thank God we don't. We have a responsible leader in Vice President Biden. Yeah, but a Stanford study just came out the other day saying that 700 people have died from these super spreader rallies. We have the president somehow thinking it's a good idea to fire Dr. Fauci when we have nearly 100,000 infections on a daily basis and 1,000 people dying. We have a president who has given up and quit, waved the white flag to the virus, and instead try to convince Americans that there's nothing to worry about so he can get them out to the polls. He's putting his own voters and his own supporters at mortal risk, and it's very unconscionable.
All right, Katie Barlow, I mean, you are a lawyer and a journalist. When you see the kinds of things that are going on at some of these campaigns, President Trump's campaigns, isn't it incumbent on law enforcement authorities to make sure that these election rallies go ahead without anyone being intimidated?
Right. I think that is what law enforcement authorities are doing across the country right now. Both Eric and Joel mentioned the FBI has opened an investigation into what happened in Texas on the roads yesterday. That is law enforcement, in fact, doing its job. The FBI is law enforcement, and investigating that is part of their job. What also is critical here is ensuring that the election is safely carried out on November 3rd without attacks from foreign adversaries or anyone else, and ensuring that we continue the count of the votes, which will necessarily and certainly continue after election night. There are 5 counties in Pennsylvania who have already said that they won't even begin counting absentee ballots because they're low on staff due to COVID concerns. They won't begin counting absentee ballots until Wednesday morning. So law enforcement's job and their goal in this country right now is to make sure that it is a free and fair election and that it's carried through tomorrow and that the votes are counted in a proper and orderly manner.
Right, Erin Mehta, I want to ask you about something that I know you've been working on. I'm so glad I have you on this show on the eve of the final day of voting, and that is the role of the media in this election. You know, almost for the entire first term of his presidency, President Trump has complained that the media have been very hostile to him. I should say the majority of the media. We saw recently that the media did not cover the Hunter Biden emails and allegations of corruption. Even Twitter blocked the story, and one of the country's most prominent journalists, Glenn Greenwald, actually resigned from his own news organization because he said that they were censoring him and that they were stopping him from writing stories that would hurt the Biden campaign. What do you make of the role that the media has played?
Well, I think the censorship of Hunter Biden, the Hunter Biden story, was ridiculous. If you look at the available evidence, I don't think there's anything that even directly implicates Joe Biden. But it was hard for us to figure that out because our media deliberately ignored it after the Joe Biden campaign just declared that it was disinformation or the product of Russian intelligence. And it was stunning to see the media go along with that to sort of act as a propaganda wing for the Democrats and for even tech platforms like Facebook and Twitter to prevent people from sharing it. That was, I think, shameful. I don't think that the story itself is even all that significant in the grand scheme. I think that you can compare corruption from both parties and find instances of corruption in both cases. But to try to silence it and censor it, I thought was a real low moment for the media. And I think the damage will be lasting because it's established this precedent now where if the one wing of the establishment decides that there's a story that's disfavorable, that it doesn't like, it can declare it to be non grata, disinformation, and the media, in lockstep with that candidate, will go along with it. And that just, nobody should support that, no matter what side of the aisle you're on.
Yeah, and of course, Twitter have not been consistent because they said they blocked this Hunter Biden story because it was fake news, but they didn't do the same thing with the infamous, notorious Steele dossier.
No, or many of the other conspiracy theories about Trump being a Kremlin agent, which dominated our politics for 4 years. As you say, rather than block that, media outlets amplified these insane stories about Trump being a Russian agent. So not just the principle is really shameful that's being violated, but also the hypocrisy is staggering.
Yeah. Katie, could there be legal consequences for companies like Twitter and Facebook? I mean, do you see some kind of possible regulation coming down the line?
I definitely do, both because Congress has mentioned it, the president has mentioned it, and those companies are on board. There is a law that protects companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and it's called Section 230, and it protects them from any third-party content that comes on their website. They're not liable for it. They can't be sued for it. It's pretty strong immunity for them in the courts. And both Republicans and Democrats agree that it is time to revisit Section 230. It's from 1996. At that time, Google didn't even exist. Mark Zuckerberg was not even a teenager yet. And so it was originally built to kind of help burgeoning internet companies continue to exist and flourish in the online boom. But that is no longer the case. The power and the breadth of that they have, sharing this information, being a platform where those types of stories are shared about both Biden and Trump, needs to be revisited, and how much power they have, how it can be curtailed by regulation. And everyone's on board with it, including Mark Zuckerberg, who said just this week at a Senate hearing that he's also in favor of reforming Section 230.
All right. Eric, I've got a few minutes left. I want to ask you about some good news that the president got last week, and that was that the economy grew by more than 30% in the third quarter of this year. That's gold for the incumbent president. Why did it not shift the polls?
Well, we don't know if it shifted the polls or not. Again, Arna and I have been saying this for months as I've been on this show. When you do polls, you pick up a phone and say who you're going to vote for. And clearly, let me just go back to the media a second because it'll apply here.
Yeah.
The U.S. media is wildly liberal, leans left. It leans left to the tune of 90%. So when you're picking up a phone and asking someone who they're going to vote for, it's very difficult to say, I'm going to vote for the guy that the media has painted as a misogynist, as a racist, as a homophobe, as whatever, as all these things. Instead, the same thing happened. That's why the polls are never accurate when you have someone like Trump, a candidate who is just such a big personality. It's difficult to admit you're going to do it in public or on the phone with somebody you don't know who they are, or whether or not it's going to show up on social media somewhere. And that's why it's always skewed against someone like Trump. I think the same. Okay. Unfortunately, it hasn't been Trump versus Biden. It's been Trump versus the media in 2020.
All right, Joel, very quickly, unfortunately, I've only got about 40 seconds left. Joel Biden made a speech in which he said that he is entering this race as a proud Democrat, but if he's elected president, he will rule the country, he will be president for all of America. Is that going to be possible when we look at the divisions in the country right now?
Well, it better be, because we have a lot to do. And the reason the polls haven't moved is because we're living in a miserable existence right now under Donald Trump. COVID has ravaged our country, ravaged our economy. It's not under control, and we have to have solutions. And so Joe Biden has a track record of doing that. It's not going to be pleasing to the extremes, but it's going to support the broad middle, and that's where Americans need some leadership right now.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to everyone for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.